They said the Alpha King had ordered an ugly wife, but destiny has never cared about the opinions of frightened people. The words drifted through the towering halls of Blackthorn Citadel days before the royal carriage ever appeared on the eastern road. Servants whispered them while polishing marble floors. Noble families repeated them behind jeweled fans. Young warriors exchanged knowing smiles as if they had already seen the woman with their own eyes. Every version of the story grew stranger than the last. Some claimed she hid her face because she was cursed. Others insisted no mirror could bear her reflection. By the time the rumors reached the throne room, they had become something larger than gossip. They had become a certainty. King Cale Ashford listened without expression from the carved obsidian throne that overlooked the great hall. At 31, he had earned a reputation for making impossible decisions with unshakable calm, and marrying a stranger ranked far below the burdens that rested on his shoulders every sunrise. The northern pacts had endured years of uneasy peace, held together by treaties more fragile than winter ice. One broken promise could divide the kingdom again, and every counselor knew it. That was why the Council of Elders had placed a sealed document before him only 3 nights earlier. The agreement was simple. A marriage between the royal bloodline and House Hart would secure alliances stretching hundreds of miles across the frontier. Refusal would reopen old rivalries no one wished to awaken. Love was never mentioned once. Duty appeared 16 times. Cale signed the decree without hesitation. Bring her to Blackthorn Citadel, he had ordered. We will honor the treaty. He never asked about her appearance. He never asked whether she smiled, feared the journey, or dreamed of another life. Those questions belonged to ordinary men. Kings rarely enjoyed such luxuries. Yet even he could not silence the endless stream of whispers filling his castle. Your Majesty, Lord Cedric said carefully that afternoon as sunlight spilled across stained glass windows, perhaps we should prepare you. Lady Evelyn Hart has, an unfortunate reputation. Cale lifted his eyes from a stack of petitions. Reputation is often written by people with too much free time. Cedric hesitated. Even so, the court expects entertainment, Cale interrupted quietly. It will survive disappointment. The chamber fell silent. Outside, distant bells echoed across the mountain valley as merchants closed their market stalls before evening fog rolled over the cliffs. Somewhere beyond those ridges, a royal carriage climbed the winding road toward the capital. Inside sat the woman everyone believed they already understood, though not a single soul within Blackthorn Citadel had ever looked into her eyes. Cale returned his attention to the documents before him, unaware that every rumor carried into his throne room had hidden the truth instead of revealing it, and with every mile the approaching carriage traveled, the future he believed he had accepted was quietly becoming something he could never have imagined. The royal carriage rolled steadily through towering pine forests where morning mist drifted like silver ribbons between ancient trees, carrying Evelyn Hart farther from the only home she had ever known. The journey had already lasted 4 days, covering nearly 200 miles across the northern territories, yet no one inside the escort spoke more than a handful of words at a time. The soldiers assigned to protect her remained polite but distant, stealing uncertain glances whenever they believed she was not looking. They had heard the stories too. Every village they passed seemed to add another layer to the legend that traveled ahead of her. Children peeked from cottage windows before being hurried inside by anxious parents. Merchants lowered their voices the moment the royal banner appeared. Even travelers resting beside the road paused long enough to whisper as the wheels disappeared into the distance. Evelyn noticed every curious stare, but she neither hurried nor hid from them. She simply folded her hands in her lap and watched the mountains rise beyond the carriage window, her calm expression revealing nothing of the thoughts quietly moving behind her pale blue eyes. Across the kingdom, Blackthorn Citadel prepared for an arrival unlike any royal celebration in living memory. Seamstresses pressed elegant table linens. Musicians rehearsed graceful melodies that echoed through endless corridors. Floral arrangements filled the grand hall with the scent of fresh white lilies, yet beneath every polished surface lingered anticipation sharpened by rumor rather than joy. Noble guests arrived hours early, eager to witness what many believed would become the greatest embarrassment in the kingdom's recent history. Lady Beatrice Holloway smiled as she accepted a crystal glass from a servant. "Imagine being forced into such a marriage," she murmured to the women gathered around her. "Perhaps His Majesty values treaties more than appearances." Soft laughter circled the room before fading beneath the sound of enormous castle doors opening and closing as more guests entered. High above the hall, King Cale stood alone on a stone balcony overlooking the valley below. Thick clouds drifted across distant peaks while cool autumn air carried the scent of cedar and approaching rain. He watched the eastern road disappear into the forest, knowing the royal procession would arrive before sunset if weather remained favorable. Behind him, footsteps echoed across polished stone. Lord Cedric stopped several feet away. "Scouts have sent word, Your Majesty. The carriage crossed Silver Creek less than an hour ago." Cale nodded once. "Have the guest chambers been prepared?" "Everything is ready." Cedric hesitated before adding quietly, "There is still time to postpone the public reception until tomorrow." Cale turned slowly, his expression composed as always. "Because of gossip?" Cedric lowered his eyes. "Because people have already decided what they expect to see." A faint breeze lifted the edge of the king's dark cloak as he looked back toward the winding road stretching beyond the mountains. "Then perhaps," he answered calmly, "today will remind them that expectations are often the least reliable guide to the truth." Far below, hidden beyond one final ridge, the royal carriage continued climbing toward Blackthorn Citadel, carrying a woman the entire kingdom believed. It understood, while not a single person waiting inside the castle had ever paused long enough to wonder who Evelyn Hart truly was. The first sound was not the carriage wheels but the long, clear note of the castle horn echoing across Blackthorn Citadel. Conversation stopped almost instantly. Crystal glasses rested untouched. Musicians lowered their instruments before the final note of their melody had faded. Every pair of eyes turned toward the enormous oak doors overlooking the front courtyard. Beyond the tall windows, the royal carriage rolled through the open gates at an unhurried pace, its polished black finish carrying only the silver crest of House Hart. It looked remarkably ordinary for a procession that had inspired weeks of endless gossip. Servants lined the marble staircase while royal guards stood motionless beneath fluttering banners. King Cale Ashford descended from the upper landing with measured steps, his expression unchanged, offering neither anticipation nor disappointment. Around him, whispers spread like ripples across still water. "She is finally here. Do not stare. I heard she never shows her face." Perhaps the stories were true. The carriage came to a gentle stop. For one quiet heartbeat, nothing happened. Even the breeze seemed to disappear beneath the weight of expectation. Then the door opened from the inside. A gloved hand appeared first, slender and steady, accepting no assistance from the waiting footman. Evelyn Hart stepped onto the stone courtyard with calm confidence, wearing a simple ivory traveling dress beneath a charcoal cloak trimmed with soft gray wool. There were no sparkling jewels resting around her neck. No elaborate crown decorated her golden hair, which had been gathered neatly behind her shoulders. She carried herself with quiet dignity instead of practiced elegance, and somehow that made every extravagant gown surrounding her seem strangely unimportant. Silence settled over the courtyard. Not admiration. Not shock. Simply silence, as though every rumor had dissolved before anyone could remember the next cruel word they intended to speak. She was not the woman they had imagined. Her face held gentle features, touched by the cool autumn air, but it was not flawless beauty that captured every gaze. It was serenity. She looked neither frightened nor proud. Her pale blue eyes moved across the ancient castle with thoughtful curiosity instead of anxious hesitation, and her peaceful composure spread through the gathering crowd in a way no one could explain. Cale watched her descend the final carriage step without realizing he had forgotten the prepared greeting repeated by his advisors all morning. For the first time in many years, he found himself studying someone without searching for political advantage or hidden motive. Evelyn lifted her eyes and met his across the courtyard. The distance between them measured only a few dozen feet, yet the restless whispers faded until all Kale noticed was the unusual steadiness in her gaze. She lowered her head in a respectful greeting, neither timid nor overly familiar. "Your Majesty," she said softly, her voice carrying clearly through the quiet air. "Thank you for receiving me." Kale answered almost automatically. "Welcome to Blackthorn Citadel, Lady Evelyn." Around them, nobles exchanged uncertain glances. The woman before them did not resemble the tale they had repeated so confidently. One by one, certainty gave way to confusion, and somewhere within that uneasy silence, the first crack appeared in the carefully built wall of lies that had traveled across the kingdom long before Evelyn Hart ever reached its gates. The formal welcome ended with perfect courtesy, yet an invisible distance remained between the king and the woman who had unexpectedly unsettled every expectation inside Blackthorn Citadel. A servant quietly guided Evelyn through wide stone corridors illuminated by tall windows where late afternoon sunlight painted long golden lines across the polished floor. Portraits of former rulers watched from towering walls, each face carrying the unmistakable confidence of those born to command kingdoms. Evelyn paused only once, studying an old painting of the castle during winter before continuing without asking a single unnecessary question. Behind her, curious eyes followed from every doorway. Housekeepers slowed their work. Young attendants exchanged silent glances. Even the palace librarian looked up from his desk as she passed. They had prepared themselves to witness someone broken by cruel rumors, yet the woman walking through the royal residence carried herself with quiet assurance that refused to fit the story they had repeated for weeks. Meanwhile, King Kale returned to the council chamber where maps and official reports covered a long oak table. Lord Cedric unfolded another treaty while several advisors waited for instructions regarding the upcoming marriage ceremony. "Your Majesty," one council member began carefully, "shall we continue with the original announcement before tonight's banquet?" Kale rested one hand against the back of his chair without immediately answering. His thoughts drifted unexpectedly toward the brief exchange in the courtyard. Lady Evelyn had spoken with neither fear nor ambition. She had offered respect without surrendering her dignity. That balance was uncommon. "Proceed as planned," he finally replied. "There will be no changes." The advisors nodded, though several exchanged puzzled expressions after noticing the unusual pause before his answer. An hour later, palace custom required the future bride and king to share tea in the winter garden before the evening meal. The garden stood beneath an enormous glass ceiling where climbing roses and evergreen vines softened the gray stone surrounding them. Small fountains filled the quiet space with the gentle sound of flowing water. Evelyn arrived precisely on time, dressed in the same simple elegance that had silenced the courtyard earlier that day. Kale stood as she approached, offering the seat across from him. "I hope your journey was comfortable," he said. "It was long," Evelyn answered with a gentle smile, "but beautiful. Your forests are unlike any I have seen before." There was no attempt to flatter him. She simply spoke the truth as she experienced it. A servant poured warm tea before disappearing into the distance, leaving the two alone beneath the afternoon light. Several moments passed in comfortable silence. Kale had attended countless diplomatic meetings throughout his reign, yet this conversation felt strangely different. Most visitors arrived eager to impress him or anxious to earn his approval. Evelyn did neither. Instead, she watched a pair of bluebirds settle near the fountain with genuine interest before quietly saying, "They seem very comfortable here." That usually means the people caring for the gardens are kind. Kale looked toward the birds, then back at her. Most guests noticed the architecture first. She smiled softly. "Buildings tell us about power. Small living things usually tell us more about people." For reasons he could not immediately explain, those simple words lingered in his mind long after they were spoken. Beyond the garden walls, unseen by either of them, several nobles observed from a covered balcony. Lady Beatrice narrowed her eyes as Evelyn laughed gently at something the head gardener said while passing with a basket of freshly trimmed flowers. There was no performance in her kindness. No calculation. Only quiet sincerity. And as the afternoon faded toward evening, the first seeds of doubt began growing not only within King Cale's heart, but also among those who had once believed every cruel rumor without question. The following morning arrived beneath a sky washed clean by gentle overnight rain, leaving the gardens of Blackthorn Citadel shimmering with tiny drops that caught the first light of sunrise. Preparations for the royal banquet filled every corridor as servants carried polished silver trays and fresh flowers from one wing of the castle to another. Evelyn preferred to remain out of the way, quietly exploring the public gardens after receiving permission from the head housekeeper. She admired the careful rows of herbs, paused to thank an elderly groundskeeper for explaining the names of unfamiliar northern flowers, and smiled warmly when several young kitchen assistants shyly greeted her. None of them expected the future queen to remember their names after a single introduction, yet she repeated each one without hesitation. Her kindness spread through the staff more quickly than any rumor ever had. At the opposite end of the castle, King Cale spent the morning reviewing trade reports with Lord Cedric. Until a sudden commotion drifted through the open windows facing the gardens. It was not the sound of panic, only confusion mixed with hurried footsteps. Cale stood and walked toward the terrace overlooking the courtyard below. Near the stone fountain, a small delivery cart had tipped onto uneven ground after one wheel slipped into a shallow rut left by the rain. Several wooden crates had fallen across the pathway, scattering bundles of herbs, folded linens, and baskets of fresh fruit. A young kitchen apprentice stood frozen beside the overturned cart, his face pale with worry as older servants rushed toward the mess. Before anyone began assigning blame, Evelyn quietly knelt beside the scattered supplies. She gathered bruised apples into one basket, carefully folded clean linens away from the damp stones, and thanked each person who stepped forward to help instead of criticizing anyone for the accident. When the frightened apprentice struggled to apologize through trembling words, she offered him a reassuring smile. "No one learns confidence without making mistakes," she said gently. "Today we simply clean together, and tomorrow you will know this road better than anyone else." The young man looked at her with visible relief before immediately joining the others with renewed determination. Within minutes, what could have become a morning of embarrassment turned into quiet teamwork as gardeners, servants, and stable hands worked side by side. Standing above the courtyard, Cale watched every moment without announcing his presence. He had expected grace during formal ceremonies because noble families practiced such things from childhood. What surprised him was the effortless compassion shown when no audience mattered. Evelyn never looked around to see who might be watching. She never attempted to draw attention to herself. Once the final basket had been returned to the repaired cart, she thanked every helper before brushing a trace of dirt from her sleeves as though nothing unusual had happened. Lord Cedric stepped beside the king and followed his gaze into the courtyard below. "Interesting," he murmured. Cale remained silent for several moments before finally asking, "Who assigned her to help?" Cedric looked puzzled. "No one, Your Majesty. She walked over on her own." Cale continued watching as the grateful apprentice bowed deeply to Evelyn before hurrying back toward the kitchens with renewed confidence. The king had spent years studying strength in warriors, wisdom in advisors, and loyalty in allies, yet the quiet influence of simple kindness was something no council meeting had ever measured. As Evelyn disappeared beneath an archway lined with climbing ivy, Cale found himself asking a question that had never occurred to him before. If the rumors about her had been so completely wrong, what else had the kingdom accepted as truth without ever looking closely enough to see for itself? That evening the first stars appeared above Blackthorn Citadel while music drifted softly through the grand hall, yet King Cale found himself paying less attention to the celebration than to the unanswered questions quietly gathering in his mind. Every conversation he had witnessed since Evelyn's arrival contradicted the stories that had reached the capital months earlier. She had spoken kindly to servants without seeking recognition. She had carried herself with dignity despite being surrounded by strangers. Most unusual of all, she never once defended herself against the whispers that still lingered in distant corners of the room. It was as though she had grown accustomed to allowing people to discover the truth on their own. After the banquet concluded, Cale asked Lord Cedric to remain behind. The towering hall gradually emptied until only flickering candles illuminated the polished stone floor. "I want everything we have on House Hart," Cale said quietly. Cedric looked surprised. "The diplomatic records, Your Majesty." "Everything. Family correspondence, trade agreements, court reports, and any witness statements collected over the last 10 years. Cedric studied the king's expression for a brief moment before nodding. "I will have the archives open tonight." Less than an hour later they stood inside the royal library, where shelves stretching nearly 40 feet high protected centuries of carefully preserved documents. The elderly archivist carried several weathered boxes to a large reading table before leaving them alone. Cale began turning one page after another with steady patience. The earliest records described House Hart as respected, generous, and deeply trusted throughout the Eastern Territories. Community leaders praised Evelyn's father for supporting schools and winter shelters. Local merchants repeatedly mentioned the family's honesty. Then, almost 4 years earlier, everything changed. Anonymous complaints suddenly appeared in county records. Unverified letters questioned Evelyn's character without offering evidence. Social invitations stopped. Rumors spread through neighboring towns with remarkable speed, yet every accusation relied on phrases such as "people have said" or "it is widely believed." There were almost no first-hand accounts. Cale closed one report and opened another. "This does not make sense," he said. Cedric leaned closer. "What have you found?" Cale placed 2 documents side by side. The official tax inspectors praised House Hart during the same season these rumors supposedly reached every village. If the family had truly become disgraced overnight, someone in authority would have documented a reason. Cedric slowly nodded. Instead, every allegation repeats another allegation. Exactly. Cale continued reading until he discovered a personal letter written by a retired village teacher. Unlike the anonymous reports, this one carried a signature. The elderly woman described Evelyn as thoughtful, patient, and unusually generous with younger children, adding one sentence that caused Cale to pause. She wrote that kindness often frightens those who profit from envy. Cale quietly folded the letter closed. The silence inside the library suddenly felt much heavier than before. He realized the kingdom had accepted a carefully constructed illusion because repeating a rumor required far less courage than questioning it. Across the castle, unaware of the investigation unfolding in her name, Evelyn stood beside an open window in her guest chamber, gazing peacefully at the moonlit gardens below. She believed tomorrow would simply bring another day of learning an unfamiliar home. She did not know that somewhere beneath the ancient stone roof of Blackthorn Citadel, the first pieces of a hidden truth had finally begun falling into place, and once the full picture emerged, the lives of everyone who had judged her would never remain the same again. The morning of the royal recognition ceremony arrived beneath a brilliant blue sky, and Blackthorn Citadel awakened long before sunrise. Noble families filled the castle with elegant conversation while banners bearing the crest of every allied pack swayed gently above the courtyard. The great hall had been transformed with towering white lilies, polished silver chandeliers, and long tables prepared for the most important gathering since King Cale Ashford claimed the throne. Every guest understood the ceremony would formally introduce Evelyn Hart as the future queen before the entire northern kingdom. Yet beneath the graceful smiles and respectful greetings, old whispers refused to disappear completely. Lady Beatrice Holloway watched Evelyn enter the hall wearing a graceful ivory gown that reflected quiet dignity rather than extravagant luxury. The room grew noticeably quieter as Evelyn walked beside the king with calm confidence, acknowledging every greeting with gentle courtesy. Beatrice exchanged a knowing glance with several nobles before stepping forward just as the master of ceremonies prepared to begin. "Your Majesty," she said with a pleasant smile that failed to reach her eyes, "before we celebrate such an important union, perhaps the kingdom deserves reassurance that every rumor surrounding Lady Evelyn has truly been forgotten. After all, many families still wonder whether appearances can be deceiving." The word spread through the hall like a sudden winter breeze. No one raised their voice. No one openly agreed. Yet silence itself became a kind of judgment. Several guests lowered their eyes while others waited to see how Evelyn would respond. She remained perfectly composed. Instead of defending herself, she simply folded her hands before her and answered with quiet honesty. People are free to believe what they choose. I only hope time allows them to know me better than rumors ever could. Her gentle reply left the room strangely unsettled. There was no anger to challenge. No pride to criticize. Only grace. Lady Beatrice opened her mouth as though preparing another carefully disguised insult, but before another word could leave her lips, the sound of a single measured footstep echoed across the marble floor. King Cale moved forward until he stood beside Evelyn, his calm expression carrying the unmistakable authority that had united the northern packs. His gaze swept slowly across the assembled nobles before settling on Lady Beatrice. For days, he said in an even voice, I have listened more carefully than any of you realize. The hall became perfectly still. I have read reports, letters, and records that many of you never cared to examine. I have watched Lady Evelyn when she believed no one was observing. I have seen kindness offered without expectation of reward, respect shown without demand for recognition, and dignity maintained despite endless assumptions. His words were not loud, yet every corner of the great hall heard them clearly. Cale continued, if this kingdom wishes to judge someone, then let that judgment rest upon truth rather than convenient stories. His eyes met Lady Beatrice's without anger. The greatest flaw I have witnessed since Lady Evelyn arrived has not belonged to her. It has belonged to those who accepted gossip as evidence and prejudice as wisdom. No one answered. Even the musicians remained motionless. Evelyn looked toward Cale with quiet surprise, realizing he had chosen to defend her before the entire court without being asked. In that unforgettable silence, the balance within Blackthorn Citadel shifted forever, because for the first time since her arrival, no one saw Evelyn Hart through the shadow of old rumors. They saw her standing beside a king who had chosen truth over assumption, and many began wondering whether the greatest mistake in the kingdom had never been inviting her into the palace, but failing to recognize her worth from the very beginning. No one spoke for several long moments after King Cale's words settled across the great hall. The silence carried far more weight than applause ever could. One by one, the nobles who had repeated careless rumors lowered their eyes, suddenly finding the polished marble floor far more interesting than the woman standing beside their king. The master of ceremonies finally stepped forward again, his voice steady but noticeably softer than before. By the authority of the Northern Crown and the United Pacts, we gather today to recognize Lady Evelyn Hart as the future Queen of Blackthorn Citadel. The formal declaration echoed beneath the vaulted ceiling as two royal attendants approached carrying an elegant silver case. Inside rested the ancient crest of the Northern Queens, a graceful pendant shaped like an evergreen branch surrounding a moonstone that had been passed from one generation to the next for centuries. Tradition required the king alone to present it. Cale accepted the pendant with both hands before turning toward Evelyn. For the first time since they had met, he did not see a political obligation standing before him. He saw a woman whose quiet strength had transformed the atmosphere of an entire castle without demanding attention or recognition. His voice remained calm, yet every word carried unmistakable sincerity. When this agreement was placed before me, I believed I was protecting the future of the kingdom. I understand now that the kingdom has received a gift greater than the treaty itself. Evelyn looked at him with genuine surprise, her pale blue eyes reflecting both humility and quiet emotion. Cale carefully fastened the pendant around her neck, not as a symbol of duty alone, but as a public acknowledgement of the respect she had earned through nothing more than her character. As the moonstone settled against her gown, sunlight pouring through the stained glass windows illuminated it with a gentle silver glow, drawing the attention of everyone gathered in the hall. The master of ceremonies raised his staff. Please welcome Her Future Majesty, Evelyn of House Hart. This time the applause arrived naturally. It began with the castle staff standing near the entrance, followed by the royal guards who had watched Evelyn thank servants and gardeners during her first days in the castle. Their sincere applause encouraged visiting merchants, scholars, and eventually even hesitant nobles to join them. The sound gradually filled the great hall until it echoed through every corridor of Blackthorn Citadel. Lady Beatrice remained silent, realizing that no carefully crafted rumor could compete with days of witnessed kindness. Truth had accomplished what gossip never could. Evelyn turned toward the assembled guests and offered only a simple bow. "Thank you," she said warmly. "I hope to serve this kingdom with the same respect it has shown me today." There was no triumphant speech and no trace of pride. Her gratitude felt as genuine as every quiet act of kindness that had brought her to this moment. Cale noticed how easily she shared credit with everyone around her instead of claiming the spotlight for herself, and an unexpected sense of admiration settled quietly within his heart. As music once again filled the hall and conversations resumed with a completely different tone than before, the people of the Northern Kingdom realized they had not witnessed the rise of an extraordinary queen because of beauty, wealth, or noble reputation. They had witnessed something far rarer. They had watched integrity patiently outlast prejudice, proving that the strongest foundation for any crown had never been appearance, but the quiet courage to remain true to oneself when the entire world believed the wrong story. Later that evening the celebration gradually faded into quiet conversations as guests departed beneath a sky filled with brilliant stars. Blackthorn Citadel seemed different now, not because its ancient towers had changed, but because the people within them looked at one another with greater honesty than they had only days before. Gentle lanterns illuminated the stone balconies overlooking the endless northern forests where cool mountain air carried the familiar scent of pine and cedar. Evelyn stepped onto the eastern terrace, grateful for a moment of peaceful silence after the ceremonies. She rested her hands lightly on the carved stone railing and watched the full moon rise above the distant peaks, bathing the valley below in soft silver light. A few moments later she heard measured footsteps behind her. She turned to find King Cale approaching without attendants, royal advisors, or formal announcements. For the first time since their paths had crossed, there was no council waiting for his decision and no audience expecting carefully chosen words. There were only two people standing beneath the same quiet sky. Cale stopped beside her and looked across the moonlit landscape before speaking. "I owe you an apology." Evelyn looked at him with gentle curiosity. "For what, Your Majesty?" He smiled faintly. "For believing that duty was the only reason this marriage mattered. I accepted the treaty before I ever wondered who you truly were." Evelyn lowered her eyes for a brief moment before answering. "You treated me with fairness from the day I arrived. That is more than many others chose to do." Cale slowly shook his head. "Fairness was only the beginning. Respect had to be earned, and somehow you earned it without asking for anything in return." A comfortable silence settled between them as the moon climbed higher above the castle towers. Then something unexpected happened. The moonstone pendant resting against Evelyn's gown reflected the silver light with unusual brilliance, and the ancient crest seemed to glow softly for only a few heartbeats. A cool breeze circled the terrace, carrying with it the unmistakable fragrance of evergreen forests after fresh rain. Neither of them spoke immediately, yet both felt the same quiet certainty settling deep within their hearts. It was not overwhelming or dramatic. It felt peaceful, familiar, and strangely inevitable, as though destiny had been patiently waiting until trust arrived before revealing itself. Evelyn looked toward Cale, and he met her gaze with a warmth that had not existed when she first stepped through the castle gates. There were no grand promises and no hurried declarations. Those things belonged to stories built upon excitement alone. What stood between them now rested on something far stronger. It was understanding born from patience, admiration earned through quiet actions, and hope shaped by truth instead of appearances. In the weeks that followed, the people of the Northern Kingdom discovered that their future queen visited village schools before attending royal celebrations, learned the names of castle servants before memorizing noble titles, and reminded everyone she met that kindness was never a sign of weakness. Beside her, King Cale ruled with renewed wisdom, never forgetting how easily even an entire kingdom could mistake rumor for reality. Together they became known not for the unusual circumstances that had brought them together, but for the compassion and integrity they brought to every decision they made. Long after the old whispers disappeared from memory, parents still told their children the story of the quiet young woman who entered Blackthorn Citadel carrying nothing but dignity, and of the king who discovered that the greatest strength a leader could possess was the courage to see beyond the first story the world chose to believe, because true destiny does not reveal itself through perfect appearances, but through hearts that remain faithful to truth when every easier path points somewhere else.